New York City sparkled with holiday lights that winter evening. Storefronts along Fifth Avenue glowed with elaborate decorations, reindeer made of twinkling bulbs, animated snowmen waving at children, and the smell of roasted chestnuts drifting from street vendors. It was Christmas Eve, and the city seemed alive with cheer. Families laughed, couples walked arm in arm, and children pointed excitedly at the massive Rockefeller Center Christmas tree. Stepping out of a sleek black SUV, Daniel Parker adjusted his dark wool overcoat. Tall, composed, and always carrying the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, he looked every bit the successful businessman the world knew him to be. But inside, he carried a quiet emptiness. 2 years had passed since his wife's tragic death, and though he did everything possible for his daughter, the hole in his chest never fully healed. "Daddy, hurry! We'll miss the tree lighting!" chirped Sophie, his 6-year-old daughter, bouncing with excitement. Her blonde curls peeked out from under a knitted white hat, and she clutched his hand tightly. Daniel forced a smile. "Don't worry, sweetheart. We'll see it together." They strolled slowly through the crowded sidewalks, Sophie chattering about Santa Claus and how many cookies they should leave by the fireplace that night. Daniel listened, nodding, his thoughts wandering between past memories and the effort of trying to give Sophie a magical childhood despite the shadow that loomed over their lives. Suddenly, Sophie stopped in her tracks. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Daddy, why is that lady sleeping there?" Daniel followed his daughter's gaze. At the edge of a bus stop bench, beneath the flickering light of a worn-out sign, a young woman lay curled up. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her coat was thin, her hair tangled, dusted with falling snowflakes. But what struck him most was what she held in her trembling arms. A baby. The infant was wrapped in nothing but a frayed blanket, his tiny fingers poking out, red from the biting cold. His lips quivered as if the night air was stealing the breath from him. Daniel's chest tightened. He instinctively squeezed Sophie's hand, intending to keep walking. After all, New York was filled with stories you couldn't fix. Strangers passed by every day, homeless, forgotten, invisible. But Sophie tugged back, her small face lit with concern. "Daddy, he's so little. He looks cold." Daniel knelt to meet her eyes. The innocence in her expression pierced through the armor he had carefully built since losing his wife. Sophie wasn't afraid. She wasn't skeptical. She simply saw someone who needed help. For a moment, Daniel hesitated, torn between logic and compassion. Snowflakes swirled in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, a choir sang Silent Night. Yet nothing about this moment felt silent. Taking a deep breath, Daniel let go of his daughter's hand and slowly stepped toward the bench, his heart beating faster with every step. He knew his life, and Sophie's, was about to change forever. Daniel slowed his pace as he approached the bench. The cold wind whipped through the avenue, but the young woman lying there seemed unaware, her body trembling with exhaustion. Her arms clutched the baby so tightly it was as though she feared the world might tear him away. Up close, Daniel could see how frail she looked. Her lips were pale, cracked from the wind. Her sweater was stretched thin, barely covering her wrists. The baby stirred weakly, letting out a tiny whimper that sent a chill through Daniel deeper than the winter air ever could. He glanced back at Sophie. She stood a few steps away, her mittened hands pressed together, eyes wide with hope. For her, there was no hesitation, no doubt. To Sophie, kindness wasn't a question, it was the answer. Daniel exhaled and then slowly slipped off his heavy wool coat. He crouched beside the bench and with careful movements draped the coat over the baby, tucking it gently around his tiny body. The sudden shift in warmth made the infant stir again, his small mouth opening as if to breathe easier. But the young woman's eyes shot open. Startled, she jolted upright, clutching the baby to her chest. "No, don't touch him," she cried, her voice raspy and weak, but protective. Daniel raised his hands immediately. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm not here to hurt you. Your baby looked so cold." Her eyes, wide and filled with distrust, flickered between Daniel's expensive coat, his polished shoes, and his calm, steady expression. She tightened her grip on the baby. "I don't need your pity," she muttered. Before Daniel could respond, Sophie stepped forward, her voice gentle and unshaken. "What's his name?" The young woman blinked, caught off guard. Her lips trembled before she whispered, "Ethan." Sophie's face lit up instantly. "He's so tiny, like a snowflake." She inched closer, her small hand pointing at the baby with pure wonder. "He's beautiful."
Mother's defenses wavered, just for a second. Tears welled in her tired eyes, though she blinked them back. Daniel saw it. The exhaustion of someone fighting a battle much bigger than herself. The kind of fight that left scars no one else could see. He leaned in just slightly, lowering his voice. "You can't stay out here tonight," he said firmly yet kindly. "It's too dangerous. Let me help you. Let me help him." The woman shook her head, stubborn but trembling. "People only help when they want something in return. That's the only thing I've learned." Daniel's jaw tightened. He understood. Too well, perhaps. He remembered sitting in a hospital room 2 winters ago, begging for one more Christmas with his wife, knowing that no amount of money or influence could change fate. He had wanted someone, anyone, to help him, and there had been nothing. Now here was this woman, this stranger, clutching her baby as if he was all she had left. And maybe he was. Daniel stood tall, glancing back at Sophie, who nodded as though silently urging him on. He looked at the woman again. "You don't have to trust me, but I'm not leaving that baby out here to freeze." Snow drifted down heavier now, blanketing the bench and the sidewalk around them. The young woman's arms trembled from fatigue, her grip loosening ever so slightly. She looked at her baby, then back at Daniel, and for the briefest moment, her guard slipped. His hand extended, not forceful, just steady, an invitation. Her breathing hitched, caught between pride and desperation. Then, finally, she whispered the smallest word. "Please." And with that, everything began to change. The ride back to Daniel's apartment felt like a surreal dream. The young woman, she hadn't even told him her name yet, sat in the back seat, cradling her baby protectively, her shoulders hunched as if she expected at any moment to be told to leave. The warmth of the SUV's heater was almost overwhelming after the bitter cold outside, and the baby's breathing had already eased a little under the thick coat wrapped around him. Sophie, strapped into the seat beside her, leaned forward, curious. "Can I see him again?" she asked softly, her eyes shining with wonder. The young woman hesitated, clutching her son tighter, but then slowly shifted her arm so Sophie could peek at his tiny face. "His name's Ethan," she said quietly, almost reluctantly. Sophie's smile spread wide. "Hi, Ethan. I'm Sophie. You're really, really small." The girl giggled, and for the first time, the young woman's lips twitched upward, though it faded as quickly as it came. Her eyes flicked toward Daniel's reflection in the rearview mirror. He was focused on the road, his expression unreadable, though every so often his gaze met hers in the mirror, a silent reassurance. When the SUV finally pulled into an underground garage, the young woman's grip on Ethan tightened again. The sleek black Range Rover didn't belong to the world she knew. And when the elevator doors opened into a spacious penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline, her breath caught. It was like stepping into another universe. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city twinkling below, skyscrapers glowing against the night sky. A massive Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, decorated with gold and silver ornaments, its lights casting the soft, warm glow across the polished hardwood floors. The scent of cinnamon candles and pine needles filled the air. She hovered at the threshold, afraid to move further. Her shoes, worn and damp, looked out of place against the gleaming floors. "You're safe here," Daniel said gently, setting his keys on the counter. He gestured toward the couch. "You can sit, rest. No one's going to bother you." But she didn't move. She remained standing, rocking Ethan gently in her arms, her body taut like a cornered animal. It was Sophie who broke the tension. She ran past both of them, pointing toward a guest room down the hall. "Daddy, can she sleep in there? It's right next to mine. Please." Daniel gave a small smile. "Yes, that's a good idea." He turned to the woman. "You and Ethan can stay there tonight. It has a crib we haven't used since Sophie was little." The mention of a crib made her chest tighten. She hadn't seen one in months, not since the shelter she bounced through when Ethan was first born. Slowly, she walked toward the room, her steps hesitant, every instinct still screaming to be ready to run. The guest room was cozy, decorated in soft tones, with a small crib tucked in the corner. She stood there, staring at it, unable to move. Finally, she lowered Ethan into it, her hands trembling as she pulled the blanket over him. His little chest rose and fell, peaceful for the first time in days. Her throat tightened, and she pressed a hand over her mouth to stifle the sob building inside. She hadn't expected kindness. Not here, not from him. Behind her, Daniel's voice was quiet, but steady. "Rest. Tomorrow,
Figure things out. Tonight, just sleep." For the first time in months, she realized she might actually sleep without fear. The morning sunlight spilled into the penthouse through tall windows, bathing the rooms in gold. For the first time in weeks, the young woman, still hesitant to share her name, had woken without the fear of someone banging on a shelter door or the chill of concrete beneath her back. Ethan slept more soundly than she'd ever seen, nestled in the crib as though he finally knew what safety felt like. But she didn't allow herself to relax for long. Her instincts told her nothing came free. So while Daniel was in his office and Sophie still curled beneath her blankets, she slipped into the kitchen. There, she found Margaret, the housekeeper who had been with Daniel's family for over a decade. Margaret was tall, composed, her gray hair tied neatly in a bun. Her sharp eyes immediately landed on the stranger in her kitchen. She paused, hands on her hips before speaking. "You must be the guest Mr. Parker brought home last night." The words carried no warmth, only suspicion. The young woman lowered her gaze. "I was just cleaning up a bit, washing some dishes." She reached for the sponge quickly, scrubbing plates that were already spotless. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "You don't need to do that. This isn't a shelter. Guests don't wash dishes here." Her chest tightened. "I'm not trying to take advantage. I don't want to be a burden." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then said coolly, "Mr. Parker has a generous heart, sometimes too generous. But this is his home. His daughter lives here. We don't know you. We don't know your intentions." The words cut deeper than Margaret could have known. Shame burned in her chest. She clenched the sponge, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. At that moment, Daniel walked in, rolling up his shirt sleeves. He glanced from Margaret to the young woman. "What's going on?" Margaret folded her arms. "Sir, you don't know her. She could be here for your money. You need to think about Sophie. Think about your safety." The young woman froze. The very thing she feared most, being seen as a parasite, a threat, a mistake, was laid bare in front of him. Without a word, she turned away, retreating down the hall. Inside the guest room, she began packing the few belongings she had: a worn blanket, a broken pacifier, a spare onesie. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered to Ethan, "We can't stay, not here. Before they throw us out, we'll go." She lifted him gently from the crib, clutching him close, preparing to leave. But as she opened the door, a small voice stopped her. "Are you leaving?"
It was Sophie, standing barefoot in the hallway, her hair messy from sleep. She rubbed her eyes, then ran forward, wrapping her arms tightly around the woman's legs. "Please don't go. You and Ethan are our Christmas present. Mommy always said helping others is the best gift." The young woman froze, her heart pounding. Sophie's little arms clung to her like she was already part of the family. And when she looked up, Daniel was standing at the end of the hallway, watching everything. His face unreadable, his thoughts hidden. But his eyes softened as he took a slow step forward. The hallway was silent, except for Sophie's small voice and the baby's faint whimper. The young woman, her arms full of Ethan, her bag slung over her shoulder, stood frozen, caught between shame and the pull of the child hugging her legs. Daniel moved closer, his steps deliberate but calm. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "Daddy, tell her she can stay, please. Don't let her leave." She shook her head quickly, her voice trembling. "She's right, Mr. Parker. Your housekeeper was right. You don't know me. I don't belong here. I don't want to cause trouble for you or your daughter." Daniel's gaze held her steadily, though something flickered in his eyes. A memory, a ghost from the past. For a moment, he wasn't looking at a stranger. He was looking at himself, 2 years ago, in a hospital room, holding his wife's hand as she whispered her last words. "Be kind, Daniel, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." He cleared his throat, his voice quiet but firm. "You're not causing trouble. You're protecting your son. That doesn't make you a burden. It makes you a mother." She blinked, her grip on Ethan tightening. "But you're taking a risk. Every day I step into a boardroom, I take risks. This isn't business. This is life. And sometimes the right thing isn't the safest choice. It's just the human one." Sophie tugged at her dress, her face earnest. "Stay, please. Ethan can be my baby brother. We can play together. Mommy always said Christmas is for families, and you're our family now." The young woman's throat closed. Her defenses, built from months of rejection, cracked under the weight of those innocent words. Tears welled in her eyes.
Down at Ethan, then back at Daniel, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to trust this, but I want to." Daniel gave a small nod, the faintest smile softening his face. "Then stay. Just for tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest. But tonight, you don't walk away." The young woman's bag slipped from her shoulder to the floor. She let out a shaky breath, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Sophie cheered, clapping her hands, then darted into a room to find a blanket to share with Ethan. Daniel took a step closer, his voice low but steady. "You don't have to prove yourself here. Just let us help." For the first time since stepping into his home, she nodded without protest. Not because she suddenly trusted completely, but because, for the first time in months, someone had given her permission to rest. And in that moment, though none of them realized it yet, the foundation of a new family was quietly being laid. The days that followed moved cautiously, like tiptoeing across thin ice. The young woman, still reluctant to reveal much about her past, remained quiet, always helping where she could. She washed dishes that didn't need washing, folded blankets that were already folded, as if doing something might earn her a place she still didn't believe she deserved. Daniel gave her space, but Sophie didn't. Every morning she tugged at the woman's hand, pulling her into games or asking endless questions about Ethan. Her laughter was infectious, a sound the penthouse hadn't heard enough of since Daniel's wife passed. One afternoon, while Ethan napped, the young woman wandered further down the hall than usual. A door, slightly ajar, caught her attention. She pushed it open and stepped inside. It was an art studio. Dust motes floated in beams of afternoon light that spilled across canvases leaning against the walls. Brushes sat in jars, stiff with dried paint, and tubes of color lay forgotten in drawers. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and memory. Her heart twisted. Before her life had unraveled, art had been her world. She used to sketch the people around her, capture fleeting moments in charcoal or watercolor. But when Ethan came, and her family turned her away, survival left no room for dreams. She reached out, fingertips brushing the surface of a half-finished painting. "You found her studio," came Daniel's voice behind her. She spun around, startled. He stood in the doorway, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. He stepped inside, his gaze traveling over the forgotten canvases. "This was my wife's place," he explained quietly. "She painted here almost every day. After she passed, I couldn't bring myself to come in." The young woman lowered her head. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was just—" "You're not intruding," he said gently. Maybe it's time someone used this room again." Her chest tightened. The thought of holding a brush again both terrified and thrilled her. That night, when the apartment was quiet, she returned. She found an old sketchbook tucked away in a drawer, along with a stub of charcoal. Sitting by the window, she let her hand move. Lines formed, shaky at first, then stronger. She sketched Sophie's smile, the softness of Ethan's sleeping face, the distant look in Daniel's eyes when he thought no one was watching. Hours passed unnoticed. When she finally set the charcoal down, tears filled her eyes. She hadn't just remembered how to draw, she had remembered who she was. The next morning, Sophie bounded into the studio and gasped. "You did this?" she asked, pointing at the sketches. The woman nodded, nervously. Sophie grinned. "You're amazing! Daddy, come look!" Daniel entered, his eyes falling on the drawings. He stood silent for a long moment, his throat tight. The way she had captured Sophie's joy, her daughter hadn't looked that alive since her mother's passing. Finally, he spoke. "You have a gift, and gifts aren't meant to stay hidden." Her eyes shimmered, the corners of her lips curving in the faintest smile. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. The invitation came 2 days later. Daniel appeared at the studio doorway, his tie loosened after a long day, watching her add color to a sketch of Ethan's tiny hand clutching Sophie's finger. "There's a charity gala this weekend. I'd like you to come with me." She froze, brush hovering over the page. "Me? No, I don't belong at something like that." "You do," he insisted gently. "And it's not about belonging, it's about being seen." Her chest tightened. The thought of standing among wealthy strangers, dressed in gowns she couldn't even dream of affording, terrified her. "I don't have clothes for something like that. I wouldn't know what to say." Daniel smiled faintly. "That's the easy part. The only thing you have to do is show up." The night of the gala, a local boutique delivered a simple but elegant navy blue dress Daniel had arranged. Sophie squealed delight when she saw her try it on, spinning around her like she was a princess. The young woman barely recognized herself in the mirror. For the first time, she didn't look like someone the world had cast aside. She looked like someone with worth. The ballroom sparkled with chandeliers and polished marble floors. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, carrying trays of champagne. A string quartet played softly as guests mingled in glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos. At Daniel's side, she tried to stay small, unnoticed, but his presence drew attention. People greeted him warmly, then let their gazes drift to her, curiosity thinly veiled. It wasn't long before the whispers began. She heard fragments as they passed. Who is she? Not his usual type, looks so young. She excused herself, wandering near the dessert table where towers of macarons gleamed under soft lights. That was when a sharp voice sliced through the hum of the crowd. "Well, if it isn't the Christmas charity case." She turned. A tall, elegant woman with perfect hair and a cruel smile approached, a glass of wine in hand. Her name was Victoria, someone clearly from Daniel's world. "I knew I recognized you," Victoria continued, her tones syrupy with mock sympathy. "You're the girl from 48th and 7th, aren't you? The one with the baby on that freezing bench. How touching." The young woman's face burned. Her hands clenched the stem of the untouched glass she held. "Don't worry," Victoria went on, her smirk widening. "Stories like yours make men like Daniel look like saints. It must be nice to go from street corners to ballrooms overnight. Almost like a fairy tale, isn't it?" The words struck harder than any winter wind. Humiliation surged through her chest. She set the glass down, turned without a word, and walked quickly out of the ballroom, into the cold night air. Snow drifted softly under the streetlights. She wrapped her arms around herself, the biting cold nothing compared to the ache inside. Tears stung her eyes. Moments later, footsteps crunched in the snow behind her. Daniel's voice came, steady but gentle. "You didn't have to walk out." She shook her head, not turning. "They're right. I don't belong in there. To them, I'll always be the girl on the bench." Daniel slipped off his coat and placed it around her shoulders. "You don't need their approval. You don't owe them an explanation. You're not the girl on the bench anymore, and you never were what they thought." She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with pain and disbelief. But in that moment, she saw something else too. Not pity, not charity, but truth. He meant every word. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe him. A few days after the gala, the city was quieter. The holiday rush had calmed, leaving behind streets dusted with snow and shop windows glowing faintly. The young woman, who had finally told Sophie her name, Emily, decided to take Ethan for a walk through Central Park. The air was crisp, her breath visible in the late afternoon chill. Families strolled with sleds, children threw snowballs, and couples huddled close under scarves. For a moment, Emily felt almost normal. She pushed the stroller slowly, her gloved hands gripping the handle, Ethan bundled tightly inside, his tiny hat slipping over his eyes. She stopped near a bench, adjusting the blanket around her son. That's when a voice she hadn't heard in over a year sliced through the winter air. "Emily!" Her body stiffened. Slowly, she turned. Standing a few feet away was a woman in a tailored beige coat, her posture straight, her hair perfectly pinned. Her mother. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. The older woman's eyes swept over her daughter, then fell to the stroller. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "So it's true, you had the baby." Emily swallowed hard. "His name is Ethan." But her mother didn't lean closer, didn't smile at her grandson. Instead, her gaze hardened. "You have brought shame into this family, Emily. Do you understand that? Parading around with a child born out of wedlock, depending on strangers to survive." Emily's throat tightened. "I didn't parade anything. I did what I had to do. You turned me away." The woman's face didn't soften. If anything, her voice grew sharper. "You chose this path. You chose disgrace. Don't expect me to clean it up now." Ethan stirred in the stroller, letting out a soft cry. Emily bent quickly, soothing him, tears stinging her eyes. She looked back up at her mother, searching for even a flicker of warmth. "He's your grandson," she whispered. But the older woman only shook her head, already turning away. "You made your decision. Live with it." And then she walked off, her heels clicking against the snowy path until she disappeared among the crowd. Emily stood frozen, her hands trembling on the stroller handle. She wasn't shocked,
Deep down, she had expected nothing else, but still, the rejection cut like glass. By the time
Returned to the penthouse, the sun had dipped below the skyline. She slipped quietly inside, not wanting to speak. She fed Ethan, bathed him, and tucked him into the crib. Then she sank onto the couch, staring blankly at the flickering fireplace. Daniel came down the stairs, sensing something was wrong. He sat beside her, his presence calm but unyielding. What happened? She tried to shake her head, but the words spilled out. The encounter, the cold dismissal, the final nail in the coffin of any hope she still had for her family's acceptance. Daniel listened in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes steady. When she finished, he reached over, covering her trembling hand with his. "Family isn't just blood," he said softly. "Sometimes it's the people who choose to stay." Emily's eyes filled again, but this time the tears weren't only from pain. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest spark of belonging. The night began peacefully. Snow fell in soft flurries against the glass windows of the penthouse, and the fire crackled warmly in the living room. Emily had just finished rocking Ethan to sleep when she noticed something unsettling. His skin felt hot, too hot. Her stomach dropped. She hurried to grab the thermometer, her hands shaking. When the reading blinked back at her, her breath caught. 104.1 degrees. "Daniel!" she cried, her voice panicked. He was in his office, typing on his laptop, but the urgency in her voice made him leap to his feet. He rushed into the nursery to find Emily clutching Ethan, tears streaming down her face. "He's burning up! He won't open his eyes!" Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, then gently but firmly took Ethan into his arms, wrapping him securely in a blanket. "We're going to the hospital. Now." Emily followed in a daze, barely able to breathe. The elevator ride down felt endless. In the SUV, Daniel drove faster than he ever had, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Emily sat in the back, whispering desperately into Ethan's tiny ear. "Stay with me, baby. Please, please stay with me." Traffic lights blurred by, horns blared, but Daniel didn't stop. When they reached the hospital, he carried Ethan inside himself, his voice firm and commanding. "This baby needs help, now." Doctors and nurses rushed forward, lifting Ethan from his arms. Emily tried to follow, but was gently held back. She collapsed into a chair, sobbing, her whole body trembling. Daniel crouched beside her, gripping her hands tightly. "He's strong," Daniel said, his own voice tight. "He's going to fight this. We'll stay right here until he's okay." Through the glass window of the emergency room, they watched as doctors placed a small oxygen mask over Ethan's face and hooked him up to monitors. The beeping machines filled the silence like a haunting rhythm. Hours dragged on. Emily eventually slumped against the wall, her exhaustion catching up with her. She drifted into a fitful sleep, her hands still clutching Daniel's. He stayed awake. Sitting in the stiff hospital chair, he refused to move. At one point, he slipped into the room, pulling a stool up to Ethan's bedside. He reached out, gently wrapping his large hand around the baby's impossibly small one. The sight of that tiny fist curling around his finger nearly broke him. "You're not alone anymore, and neither is your mom. I won't let either of you go through this alone again." Hours later, Ethan's fever finally broke. The monitors beeped more steadily, his breathing calmed, and a faint color returned to his cheeks. Relief crashed over Daniel like a wave. When Emily stirred awake and saw Ethan sleeping peacefully, she broke down in fresh tears, but this time the tears were from gratitude. She turned to Daniel, her voice shaking. "You stayed all night." Daniel's eyes softened. "Of course I did. That little boy matters to me. You matter." In that sterile hospital room, under the harsh fluorescent lights, Emily realized the truth. Daniel wasn't just helping out of obligation or pity. He had chosen them, both of them. Ethan recovered quickly after that terrifying night. Within days, his fever was gone, his tiny giggles filling the penthouse once more. Emily never let him out of her arms for long, but she wasn't the only one changed by the ordeal. Daniel had felt something shift inside him as he sat by that hospital crib. He no longer saw Ethan and Emily as temporary guests. They were part of his life now, and he intended to prove it. One crisp December morning, Daniel asked Emily and Sophie to come with him. He drove them to a quiet street on the Upper East Side, where boutiques and small galleries lined the block. He stopped in one with its windows covered in paper. Confused, Emily frowned. "What is this place?" Daniel's smile was subtle but full of meaning. "Yours." Her eyes widened. "Mine?" He nodded. "You said once that art was who you were. I don't want you to forget that again. This studio, this
Gallery, it's for you, for your work." Her breath caught as he unlocked the door and led her inside. The space was glowing with warm lights, the walls lined with her sketches and paintings she thought no one had noticed. The portrait of Sophie's smile, the drawing of Ethan's tiny hand, even the quiet sketch of Daniel, lost in thought by the window. Tears blurred her vision. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Daniel replied softly. "Say you'll keep creating. The world deserves to see what you see." The opening night of the gallery was intimate but powerful. Friends, neighbors, even strangers came to admire her work. For the first time in her life, Emily wasn't invisible. She was an artist, a mother, and, though she didn't fully realize it yet, part of a family again. A week later, Christmas arrived. The penthouse no longer felt like Daniel's lonely sanctuary, it pulsed with life. A massive tree glittered in the living room, decorated by Sophie and Emily together. Ethan gurgled happily on a blanket surrounded by toys, while Sophie bounced beside him, declaring herself the best big sister in the world. Emily sat on the couch, watching them, her heart full. She had once believed her life was over when her family cast her out, but here she was, surrounded by warmth, laughter, and acceptance. Daniel joined her, sitting close, their shoulders brushing. He watched the children for a long moment before turning to her. "You know, Sophie asked me last night if we're a family now." Emily's breath caught. She looked toward him, unsure. "And what did you say?" Daniel reached for her hand, his touch steady and sure. "I told her yes. Forever." Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks, but this time they weren't from pain. She smiled, leaning into him, and whispered, "Then so did I." The snow outside fell gently, blanketing the city in white. Inside, the warmth of the fire, the laughter of children, and the quiet beating of two hearts made one truth clear. What began as an act of compassion had become something far greater. They were no longer fragments of separate, broken lives. They were a family, reborn, whole, and stronger than ever.